Well, welcome everyone. Thank you all for joining us. I want to start by thanking especially Michael Golliber, but also all the other faculty, staff, students, and others for planning and working on this event. And I want to thank all of our speakers and the folks who will contribute music to the program today. I want to recognize the presence of Jonathan's three sisters, Patty, Sonia, and Brooke, and his dear friends Ben and Jenna Story, and their children Eleanor, Rosalind, and Charles, all of whom traveled far to be here with us today. We're so grateful. You've heard some music playing now by the Beatles, music which Jonathan enjoyed and associated with lifelong memories. We'll hear more music in his honor. Our program today should be about 90 minutes. It's a little hard to predict, but about 90 minutes. And if anyone needs to leave before the end, or if anyone feels they need a break or fresh air, please feel free to step out, but if possible, do so between speakers. We'll have a short pause after each speaker. And at the end of the program, you're all invited to a light reception in the junior common room. We do well simply to recognize the sadness and loss that many of us are carrying, but we are here today to honor the memory of our friend, colleague, and teacher, and to celebrate together the gift of his life and his place in our community. And in doing so, we are strengthened as a community and brought closer together, and we renew our sense of purpose. In that spirit, I invite our first speaker, Michael Golliber, to begin when he is ready.
If you need to leave early, or if you need to step out of the room, please feel free to do so. Try to do it in between speeches or performances. Thank you. Jonathan, or Mr. Hund, as my wife Tracy always playfully addressed him, easily embarrassing him. He was so easy to tease. He enjoyed being teased more than most because he knew we were all flirting with him. So, for example, one could say to him, as I did one time, I said, "I'm not entirely sure what kind of look you're going for, Jonathan, but you've neglected to shave a noticeable portion of the left side of your face." And he was fine with that. He smiled. Jonathan was a great friend and magnificent colleague. Life here at the college for me has not been the same since he left us, and I suffer from losing him each and every day. Jonathan, as everyone knows, was a most enjoyable and joyful interlocutor. I learned so much from him during my many serious and my many silly conversations with him. There was, of course, hardly any, if at all, distinction between silliness and seriousness when I spoke with Jonathan. He nailed that tragedy and comedy of life thing down. Jonathan had a twinkle or a sparkle in his eye. I imagine he would prefer sparkle rather than twinkle. Twinkle doesn't quite lend itself to the manliness he pretended to care about, dressing up as he did every day as a lumberjack. It was that sparkle that I saw when, at a question period after a lecture, I just finished asking a question and he turned around and with a real wink let me know that he knew that my question was not in fact a real question, but rather was a polite and indirect way of pointing out that the lecturer didn't know what the heck they were talking about. He was much more bold, straightforward, and ruthless in communicating such things than I. And to my astonishment, he always got away with it somehow. It was that same sparkle that I saw when sitting across from me in my Camille Paglia's study group. Paglia, by the way, was someone Jonathan was madly in love with, and he wanted to ask to marry him, despite and perhaps because of the fact that she identifies as an Amazonian lesbian. It was that sparkle I saw when I asked a question of our dear students that he could never quite believe I could get away with asking, a question he knew he could never get away with asking. And it was that same sparkle when at one of our many lunch conversations I would say something that he decided was exactly false. Behind the smile and that sparkle, he was thinking, "Michael, there's no way you could have gotten it any more wrong than that." Or at another lunch, after things got a little heated, he would back down, acknowledging that maybe, just maybe, there was something I got a bit right, and they might give it some further consideration. The final setting for such conversation was in the context of my present study group on Simone de Beauvoir's The Second Sex. Beauvoir, by the way, was someone Jonathan had no desire whatsoever to marry. Jonathan came to the first couple of these meetings, but with great selflessness, sincere selflessness, he decided to leave the group because he was sure his crankiness about the book would lead to some misbehavior on his part. After all, Jonathan cared most of all for our students and their education. The strange thing, though, was that when I walked out of the private dining room and into the dining hall after these meetings, I was always greeted by Jonathan, sitting alone at a table, waiting for me to come out. There was no wave of hand. There was only that intense sparkle, commanding me to come sit and join him. You see, he had been keeping up with the Beauvoir readings as our group was reading them. And he demanded from me, after each and every meeting, a minute-by-minute account of who said what about this astonishing claim or that inexplicable argument, and then demanded an account of why I thought that this student had said that. And then, applying psychology to ontology, demanded that we decipher together what this why of the that which was said by this particular student about this book, what that could possibly mean for the present and future of the human as such. And he grew irritated and delighted at the very same time. As deeply irritated as Jonathan may have been with us at one time or another, Jonathan deeply loved us even more. He and his speeches remind one of how Alcibiades described Socrates and his speeches as a Silenos, in all appearance a hubristic satyr, the inside of which is really something altogether divine, having the largest number of images of virtue within, applying to the whole area that is proper to examine for one who is going to be beautiful and good.
Hello. Ooh, okay, hello. My name is Emily Axelberg. Some of you don't know me. I'm a senior at the college. I've been reading with Mr. Hand all 4 years here, so I got to know him as well as a student can know a teacher in that time. And also I'm just going to say that some of the things that I have to say are really similar to some of the things Mr. Golliver just said to you, which I guess isn't surprising to me because Mr. Hand was someone who, he didn't really put on a different face for different people. And so here I go. I already wrote it, so I'm going to say it again. The most difficult part of Mr. Hand's passing for me has been accepting the fact that I will never get the chance to adequately thank him for being my teacher, if such a thing is ever really possible. With this brief speech, I would like to try to begin to express my gratitude. I would like first to thank Mr. Hand for his seriousness. This one might surprise some of you who knew him well because Mr. Hand made a lot of jokes. He seemed never to miss an opportunity for biting sarcasm and often didn't appear to pay much mind to whether or not those around him would deem his humor appropriate to the context. However, I'd like to reference briefly a commencement address that another excellent teacher of mine, Lies van Boxel, gave that touched on this point. She astutely observed in that speech that seriousness does not have to be grave. I think this is one of the most important lessons that I learned from Mr. Hand. He openly rejoiced in the work that we do here, in the books and in the company of his colleagues and students. This rejoicing often took the form of a particularly effusive and lively approach to teaching and conversation. Mr. Hand's ability to do the work here with impressive diligence and rigor while unapologetically having the most fun possible is the standard by which I continue to evaluate my own work. He taught me that the most serious response to the great books is an ecstatic kind of joy, a lightness. In a document entitled Mr. Hand's Paper Advice to Freshmen, which he sent our freshman language class, he wrote, quote, "These authors are suns, we at best mere moons, straining to reflect some of that original brilliance," end quote. Mr. Hand's particular sort of seriousness reflected the original brilliance of our authors to me and revealed the undeniable vitality of their dusty old books when I was just starting out at the college. He was my first shining example of what it means to search for humanity in the books we read, and to celebrate when we find it. His last point of advice in that same document simply reads, quote, "Have fun, really," end quote. I believe this advice, though it may not seem like much, is one of the deepest and most important lessons I have learned at St. John's. I would also like to thank Mr. Hand for his continued commitment to my education. Mr. Hand demonstrated a persistent dedication to my growth as a student and as a human being, even at times when I was not so dedicated. A good example of this, which I will relate here mostly because it's funny, is his contribution to my Donrag about my performance in language class during the second semester of my freshman year. When it was his turn to speak, he very curtly declared something like, "I think Miss Axelberg has gotten cocky and lazy." He, of course, followed this remark by saying that my writing was basically satisfactory and there were no major problems with my class participation, etc. But his first statement really stuck with me because it was the truest thing that any one of my tutors said in that Donrag. Even though my working class had been just fine, he knew that I was capable of doing better and called me to account for it so directly that I couldn't disregard him. I remember that Miss Van Boxel even asked him if she should write the first part down in the Donrag notes, to which he responded, "I don't see why not." This story is just one of the many examples throughout my time at the college of Mr. Hand noticing me slipping, academically or personally, and encouraging me to do better with the kind of totally unveiled criticism that it seems only he could get away with. The reason he got away with it, though, is because even when he was at his harshest, I never doubted that he was in my corner and wanted me to succeed. I knew that the only reason he was so tough on me is because my education mattered to him just as much, if not at times more than it mattered to me. Without his constant support, I don't know how I would have persisted through some of my roughest patches over the past 4 years. I don't think I really have to tell any of you how much it means to have a great teacher believe in you and your work. Obviously, it means a great deal. I will briefly mention my gratitude to Mr. Hand for his lesson on friendship. He once told me that he reads to make friends, and the time I spent reading with him over the past 4 years proved that to be abundantly true. I enjoyed reading with Mr. Hand not only because I had a lot to learn from him about how to read the great books, but also because it provided an opportunity for me to build the kind of trust and mutual respect with him that I had long been searching for in a mentor. Because of this willingness of his to become a friend to me, I will cherish our time together not only for how it contributed to my academic growth, but how it came to shape me more broadly as a human being in my ability to be a better friend. My last conversation with Mr. Hand was supposed to be about Book 2 of Rousseau's Emile, but we ended up returning to a discussion that began for us in my freshman language class when we were translating the Mino. We often revisited this conversation, which usually began with one of us asking, why do we even read these books anyway? What is it that we're doing here? What do we really hope to learn or gain? Both of us struggled to provide an answer sometimes. It seemed to me that Mr. Hand, like me, wasn't always completely sold on the promise of ultimate happiness some people claim you will attain when you finally manage to figure out all the secrets hidden in the pages of our most revered texts. Still, though, this work was the work of his life, and I know now that it is mine too. Faced with this version of Meno's paradox the last time we spoke to one another, Mr. Hand and I once again sided with Socrates, agreeing that, quote, "In supposing one ought to seek what one does not know, we would be better men, more able to be brave, and less idle, than if we supposed that which we do not know we are neither capable of discovering nor ought to seek. On behalf of that, I would surely battle, so far as I am able, both in word and deed." End quote. With Mr. Hand as my example, I feel confident I will continue to side with Socrates and attempt always through my seeking to be better, braver, and less idle. Thank you.
Jonathan was a serious man. And in coming to St. John's, he thought he found the serious place he was looking for. We recommended his appointment when I was dean. The recommendation from the eminent scholar Pierre Manon was long, 5 pages, handwritten, and convinced us of the excellence of imagination and intellect of our new colleague. And as we all know, this promise became real to us. Despite a generational difference, he and I had important common interests. We talked often about books and the future of the college. We were both great admirers of Plato, Tocqueville, and Hegel. About the latter, we both saw brilliance. Even when we thought Hegel was wrong, there was always a depth of insight to be fathomed. And we were both bemused, indeed amused, that Hegel was such an optimist, given the complexity of the world he presented to us. Jonathan's very fine lecture on Hegel last fall stimulated such interest that many more people signed up for our reading group than Miss Engel and I ever expected. We even joked about a groundswell of Hegelianism at the college. Such was the inspiration that Jonathan could provide. Equally, and perhaps more importantly, we talked extensively about the future of the college, and in his case, how larger developments in America seem to have affected the college's sense of itself and our mission. He despaired of the future of America and feared for the future of the college. Colleges used to be thought of as places of refuge, as places to take time to develop and mature one's thinking in order to prepare oneself for the world ahead. This character of refuge, he felt, was being eroded. We talked about the many changes the colleges had undergone, especially the changes in the role of the faculty. Foremost in his mind was the loss of co-governance, or the loss of the centrality of the faculty, our consequent diminished sense of responsibility for the whole. He saw that these were not just external changes designed to make the college more efficient, but they affected the way we think and do our mission, and thus affect who we are. Here, Jonathan understood a profound truth, that with change, there is always loss. And the changes he saw at work at the college, he feared bore too great a price. He thus feared for what was truly great about St. John's. And in the words of Hegel, it was unbearable to him to see it desecrated. Sadly, in such cases of profound loss, one can only do so much. Yet this, however inadequate it may seem, is still quite meaningful. First and foremost, let us keep our friends close. And to memorialize our departed friend, let us not forget his example. Let us aspire and rededicate ourselves as he did to make this small little college the last best hope of meaningful education. We will miss this serious man, this conscience of the college. Our loss is heaven's gain.
So, I'm Frank Pagano, and a friend of Jonathan's, like most everyone he knew. And I don't think I'm capable of speaking adequately about his personal characteristics that made Jonathan unique, like his sunrise smile that glowed with goodwill, joy, and mischief. And now I'm going to ad-lib, which you never do at things like this, and I'm going to say that this talk might seem to some people cold, but in fact I'm going to talk about Jonathan's nobility of mind. And it turns out that all his warmth comes from having an exceptional mind. So I thought I would try inadequately, and so I'm out to fail, about his mind. My theme, therefore, is Jonathan's daring intellect and courageous soul. But I must start from very far. For Jonathan was at heart a St. John's tutor. The college promotes and is defined by the conversation between the students and the great books. The tutors are peripheral. It's not their education that the college is worried about. It wouldn't matter if they were educated at all, if they could, talk. According to the St. John's statement of the program, tutors do not teach directly. They do not profess. The vocation of a tutor is to ask good questions. Recently, this humble calling has become harder to follow because good questions presume there are true questions, and in our time, the value of the truth has plummeted. Frequently, questions are asked to avoid the truth. Jonathan was one of the few who dared constantly to ask true questions. So let's try, for our own sakes, to understand the truth of his questions. Jonathan wrote primarily about Hegel, the man of many answers. Jonathan told me that he regarded Rousseau as the greater thinker. Each of the statements in Rousseau's second discourse is 100 questions. But Jonathan did not share publicly his questioning of Rousseau. Instead, he devoted himself to demonstrating for us the inestimable worth of the truth. Thus, his turn to Hegel. In some ways, Hegel is the culmination of modernity. But for Jonathan, Hegel is not, strictly speaking, a complete modern, at least from the vantage of the contemporary moment. Jonathan begins his lecture. Now I'm going to read the title. Reconciling Subjectivity and Substance, Hegel's Critique of Pure Personhood. I love that. With the claim, quote, dissatisfaction with, or at least ambivalence about, modernity is part of modernity. End of quote. The reconciliation that Hegel attempted is in one way a departure from the spirit of modernity. Hegel thinks he has achieved, according to Jonathan, an integration of the state, society, and family that prevents our person from being empty, and our being from descending into nihilism and producing a human nothingness. If Hegel's philosophical enterprise was successful, then there seems to be nothing peculiar to our time for us to ask him. What then is the question? Jonathan's lecture is an act of startling intellectual daring, for it reveals how the true question lives. The true question, the question that does not already know the answer, seeks out the right interlocutor. In our education, we must learn to be the right interlocutor for the true question. But we do not know what for us the true question is, because a true question is a hybrid, mixing ignorance and knowledge. A questioner must know and hope and fear. The question must hold out hope for the truth and the fear of the error of self-congratulation. Accordingly, in Jonathan's lecture, Hegel is not the interlocutor. He is the questioner. Hegel puts the question to modernity, including our contemporary pieties. Hegel integrates the human world, family, society, and state, In contrast, the way we like to talk and the way we like to think of ourselves is that modernity and we are revolutionaries. Following Jonathan Hegel, we see this revolution is really disintegration. The contemporary revolutionary movements in the family, society, and state tear apart the Hegelian integration. This has always been the spirit of modernity. In terms more convivial to my cruder mind, since its founding, modernity has been in decline. What then does Hegel ask our contemporaries? He asks, what is the worth of your person without the truth? This in its fullness is a terrifying question. Jonathan suggests that Hegel asked this question because he has seen us once before. Hobbes claims that each of us awards ourselves infinite value and our neighbors no value in themselves. We are the persistent deceivers of ourselves. Jonathan Hegel implicitly reveals that value, that social valuation, is an incomplete understanding of our fellow human beings. It's merely the coin of the social marketplace. I have my values, and you yours, is the social echo of an empty soul. Jonathan was not a pure Hegelian. He recognized Hegel as the proper interrogator of our times, and not the least because Hegel developed many of our approaches to our condition. Jonathan revealed how to suspend the tyrannical spirit of modernity. Without fear, he showed how to bring modernity to question its own spirit. True questioning of ourselves, of the dominant spirit of our time, shining a light in our cave, requires the strength of soul and the courage of a giant.
So I'm going to return to the theme of Jonathan as a friend. Like Mr. Pagano, I also won't be able to do justice to Jonathan's personal qualities, but I'll talk anyway. I know he was a true friend to the college, to his students, to me and others, as we've heard. He and I got to be friends back before I was a tutor, when I used to join David for lunch in the cafeteria and observe the fights he and Jonathan had there over the meaning of pretty much every single seminar reading. It wasn't that Jonathan didn't enjoy those fights. I think he liked them, and I know David loved them. But at some point, Jonathan conceived the hope that the wife might prove a less misguided and argumentative Hegel hater than the husband. So one day he asked me to lunch alone. From this grew our tradition of 4 to 5 hour margarita lunches at Harry's Roadhouse. From me, he got less fighting about philosophy, more drunken gossip, obscene jokes and petty complaints, which he always treated with great compassion. From him, I got what everyone who's been fortunate enough to call Jonathan a friend did: a profound, even visceral concern for my suffering and my good fortune, a fierce loyalty that often defeated the dispassionate judgments of his prodigious intellect, a sensitive and deeply thoughtful conversation partner, and a lively, irreverently funny drinking buddy who delighted in the ridiculous with which life in the college kept him generously supplied. He had a sharp wit and a particular gift for impressions. If I had his talent and didn't mind getting fired, I'd share some. But one of the many wonderful memories Jonathan has given me sticks with me and seems fitting to mention. Last year, I happened to have all 5 of my senior essay orals scheduled over only 2 weeks, which was a bit of a crunch and which occasioned much grumbling from me. Without mentioning it to me, Jonathan noted the date and time of my last oral. When I came out of it, there he was, with a bottle of champagne to congratulate me. We drank it in the coffee shop, where he complained to everyone who walked by about the wrong I had suffered, in, in being subjected to so grueling a schedule. He made sure everyone knew of my heroic virtue in enduring such a trial and called angrily for the punishment of all responsible. Little did he know, my feat was much less impressive than he imagined. It was Jonathan's practice to devote to each senior oral an entire weekend of preparation, which issued in multiple typed single-space pages of careful commentary for every single essay. Excuse me, it didn't seem to occur to him that most of us give of ourselves less generously than he did, which was certainly true in my case. Anyway, after we polished off the bottle, I left. Jonathan struck up a 2-hour conversation with a student about books and the meaning of friendship, a conversation which so impressed the student that he told me about it many months later. This was all standard Jonathan, I think. His generosity and intense care for his friends, for his obligations to the college, for students in general, were central to who he was. As has been said, he was gravely concerned about the possibility of deep human attachment in the modern world. In his own words, taken from a beautiful speech he gave in honor of his beloved mother on her 80th birthday, quote, "Modernity is a world of self-interest, of commerce, of fluid contractual relationships, of social ties that are made and unmade daily." His favorite image of modern human beings as slices of Kraft Singles cheese, that is, of human beings as mass-produced, identical person units, individually sealed off and protected from one another by plastic wrap, was invoked often by him. Happily, Jonathan himself provided a very different example of what human connection could be. His intensity of feeling and devotion to what he thought right could make him quick to anger, but unlike so many bloodless academics, he cared about things worth caring about and had the nerve to stick up for what was important, even when it didn't win him any friends. This combination of intense liveliness and awareness of the deepest human concerns, together with a very powerful intellect, is extremely rare. Jonathan was a great boon to the college, a great delight and comfort to his friends. I miss him very much, and I count myself extremely grateful to have known him.
Hi, you all. I'm Ben Story, an old friend of Jonathan's from graduate school and beyond, I'll tell you. I met Jonathan some 20 years ago. Both of us were graduate students at the Committee on Social Thought at the University of Chicago. It was the spring of 1999. I was finishing my first year, and I was still more than a little green, curious and eager, but inexperienced and poorly read. I was a kid who showed up from my state school education in the South to find myself surrounded by people from Yale and other such places who were infinitely better initiated into the ways of the academic world than I. Jonathan was older and wiser. He had read widely and he had traveled much, but he was also utterly devoid of academic pretension. He'd been to Harvard and Yale, but he didn't tell me that. He never dropped names. He never jingled his Phi Beta Kappa key. He had an infinite amount to share with me, which he did with great generosity. But he was also unfailingly curious, always asking what I was reading and thinking about, with his eyes always peeled for new things that might engage his indefatigable attention. We were both there to study philosophy, and philosophy for Jonathan was three things. It was political, it was personal, and it was comedic. Political. Jonathan had no taste for metaphysical abstractions. He was interested in the question of how to live and how the spirit of the laws under which we live shapes our souls. Personal. Jonathan thought that the ideas and thinkers that interested us were reflections of our character, and that you could tell a lot about a person from that person's taste in books and ideas. And finally, comedic. As everyone who knew Jonathan knows, he was a great teacher, and he was honored with a teaching award while we were in Chicago. Interviewed about that award for the student paper, he remarked that a teacher was part priest, part lawyer, and part comedian. He could do all three, but his comic talents were extraordinary. He excelled in imitations of the sages, living and dead, who surrounded us in Hyde Park, because this is a long time ago, and nobody's going to fire me. I'm going to do some of those imitations. Yeah. As Alan Bloom was forever spraying cigarette ashes around and saying, the problem of being, his Martha Nussbaum. And he had once been on a date with Martha Nussbaum, I can say that now. She was forever droning on an absurd falsetto about autonomy and wearing leather pants and solidarity with somebody or other. Jonathan gave marvelous nicknames. For example, the chairman of the Committee on Social Thought, Robert Pippin, who was and is a brilliant scholar, who commanded the respect of all of us, Jonathan very much included. But Jonathan didn't respect Robert Pippin so much that he wouldn't give him a nickname. Yeah. Pippin was then writing about Hegel. And it's interesting. Hegel was not Jonathan's guy 20 years ago. This is new. Anyway, Hegel, as you all know, has a progressive theory of history that culminates in the liberal bourgeois modern life that we all find ourselves living, with all of its material trappings, from the white picket fence to the microwave oven. And Jonathan cut through all the technical Hegelian vocabulary in which Pippin was so fluent, so as to give him a splendid moniker, the high priest of the minivan. So Jonathan's wit always brought life and thought together. In his way of thinking and talking, I found the kind of playful, honest, learned, but unpretentious philosophy I had come to Chicago to study. Jonathan was my unofficial but deeply influential teacher, and he shaped my own way of thinking and talking as much as anyone on the actual faculty of the university. The classroom in which I got my lessons from Jonathan was a Hyde Park greasy spoon called Salonica. There, we would meet almost every Sunday for long, leisurely brunches. Jonathan would peruse the menu for form's sake and then proceed to order the same thing every time: skirt steak and eggs, the steak medium rare, the eggs over easy, and then he'd get whole wheat toast for health's sake. He would do so in flirtatious engagements with his favorite waitress, who was a crusty Chicago dame who gave as good as she got and who plainly enjoyed their repartee. We would spend about 3 hours there, drinking large quantities of thin American coffee and talking about everything: Plato, Shakespeare, Tocqueville, our teachers, our friends, the young women in our circle. It was at that table, in Jonathan's company, that I really learned to think my life through. For it was at that table that I learned how life and thought come together. Afterwards, in the summer, we would repair to Promontory Point Park, which juts out into Lake Michigan, and we'd swim off our brunch there. It was Jonathan who taught me that swimming in Lake Michigan is in fact possible, in spite of the frigid temperatures and the occasional E. coli warnings. For Jonathan, he was an adventurous spirit as much as a learned one, and neither one of us ever caught E. coli or frostbite. Before long, I started dating one of the young women in our circle, Jenna Silber. Jenna and Jonathan were also friends, and the three of us spent many hours in one another's company. Both of us formed our adult selves in conversation with him, and Jenna and I became a couple in the context of those conversations. When we married in 2003, Jonathan gave a mischievous, beautiful toast at our rehearsal dinner that people remarked to me about for many years thereafter. Eventually, we both left Hyde Park for our teaching careers, mine at Furman University in Greenville, South Carolina, and Jonathan eventually had come here. You all know Jonathan's work here better than I do, but I always thought that St. John's was made for Jonathan and Jonathan for St. John's. For the mind of a St. John's tutor must be both powerful and ready for anything, and Jonathan had those two qualities in spades. My own teaching at Furman was deeply marked by his influence. I agree with Jonathan that a teacher is part priest, part lawyer, and part comedian. I'm more priestly than Jonathan was, but I make my efforts at wit as well. And when I listen to myself talk, I sometimes realize I'm repeating phrases I learned from him. More than that, my own whole way of thinking about philosophy as something intimate and personal, something that we can see in all of our everyday interactions, from the breakfast table to the convenience store, comes from him. One could see this influence in our shared love of the gauche Swiss French philosopher Rousseau, who brought life and thought together in a sprawling, unholy, but brilliant mess, equal part intellect, honesty, and absurdity. Jonathan visited my family many times in Greenville, South Carolina, sometimes at Christmas or Thanksgiving, sometimes just to hang out. Once, we all went for a hike in the mountains near there. On the way home, we stopped for lunch at a squirrely-looking South Carolina roadside joint called the F-Mart. The proprietor was a guy with a handlebar mustache, a 10-gallon hat, a brass belt buckle the size and shape of Texas, took one look at us and decided that he'd have himself some fun. When he found out that we were college professors, nothing could be better than that, he began quizzing us on all manner of trivia that he'd picked up in his correspondence school education, which wasn't half bad. After he'd stumped me, the political science professor, by asking about the running mates of failed presidential candidates of the 1890s, he turned towards science, and Jonathan took over. Mr. F-Mart had met his match. Before long, he was sitting slack-jawed at our table as Jonathan patiently explained the special theory of relativity to him, using the salt and pepper shakers to illustrate. When we told my kids of Jonathan's death, and were talking about his brilliance and his honesty with them, my middle daughter, Rosalind, who's sitting over there, reminded us of his bravery, for she remembered the stories he told when he visited us after spending a sabbatical sailing across the Atlantic through a near hurricane in a boat that was no match for such weather. Most professors, after all, spend their sabbaticals in libraries, not Jonathan. And thinking about what it means to have and lose a friend such as Jonathan, a remark of one of his favorite authors, Alexis de Tocqueville, sprang to my mind. In his memoirs, Tocqueville writes that, "Whenever there is nothing in a man's thoughts or feelings that strikes me, I, so to speak, do not see him. I have always supposed that mediocrities, as well as men of parts, had a nose, a mouth, and eyes, but I've never been able to fix in my memory the forms that those features take in each particular case. I must constantly ask for the names of such men. Yet it is not that I despise them, but I have little truck with them, feeling that they are like so many cliches. I respect them, for they make the world, but they bore me profoundly." Who has ever been less of a cliche than Jonathan Hand? And who has ever been bored by him? Jonathan suffered. He could be difficult. Everyone who knew him well knew that. But I knew him in the roles in which he was at his best, as my teacher and my friend. A few years ago, the two of us met up in Roscoe, New York for a weekend. The place was an old haunt of Jonathan's and boasted of the two things that, in Jonathan's eyes, guaranteed a good weekend. It had a very good diner and it had an excellent swimming lake. It was delightful, and Jonathan plainly delighted in introducing me to it. He had discovered many beautiful things in life, and he was always eager to share them. The man I am, the person my wife and my children and my students know. Was formed by and through him. He was a singular and decisive presence in my life, whose like I have no hope of meeting again. I do not know if Jonathan believed in blessings, but he was a blessing to me and to many others. To his sisters and his parents in Ithaca, I want to thank you for sharing this extraordinary man with me, my family, for so many years. And I also want to thank all of you here. It took work to hold a man like Jonathan together, and you all were very generous to him. For a very long time. Thank you.
I want to thank Walter, you and the college, and Patty, Brooke and Sonia, and everybody who's come together today to give us the opportunity to hear what Jonathan meant to each of you, and to give us the opportunity to try to articulate what he meant to us. I found it very difficult, very challenging to do that. In part, that's because I met Jonathan so long ago. I met him in the spring of 2000. At the time, his home was the International House at the University of Chicago, and mine was too. iHouse is a home for graduate students from all over the world. We lived in what we thought were monk-like conditions, with hard beds, desks nailed to the wall, a small window that you could crank open to get a little bit of fresh air in the winter. Jonathan was somehow grandfathered out of those Spartan-like conditions. However, he somehow finagled to live in the turret of the castle-like building of the iHouse, which he called a penthouse. It was a spacious room with lots of windows and access to the roof. So we were both students at the committee on at the University of Chicago at the Committee on Social Thought. But when I first remember encountering him, it was in the lounge of the iHouse. I was finishing up my first year of graduate school, and he came up and sat down next to me. I remember pouring out my thoughts on Freud and on Foucault. I remember relating to him what I'd learned from Edward Gibbon on the art of note-taking. I remember informing him that Hegel's much easier to read if you read it in German. Perhaps the beginning of a great career. When I try to recall that conversation, as I did with lots of effort for today's event, I tried to remember what he said to me, and I can't. I think that's because what Jonathan did then, as he did for so many of us, so many times, is to listen, to ask questions and to listen. A little while later, Jonathan and I got together with some other students to try to find and rent a house for social thought types, 5605 Drexel Avenue. It was an institution for some time. Jonathan always had more energy for homemaking than the rest of us. He was 20 years our senior. He would spend quite a bit of time in the kitchen, cooking pots, or vats, as he called them, vats of beef stroganoff or chicken cacciatore, beef stroganoff or chicken cacciatore, again and again. And we would consume them around the dining room table. We would stay up late into the night talking, and then we'd get up in the morning and we'd do it all over again. When you're young like that, in your early 20s, you literally don't know what you're saying, I think. I think you're a kind of bundle of impressions and stories and thoughts, but you haven't gained the perspective to say who you are, or at least I hadn't. Jonathan helped us all gain that perspective. He drew us out. And in due time, he taught us what it meant to be men and women, what it meant to be moderns, what it meant to be Americans, what it meant to be teachers. It might sound melodramatic to say it this way, but it seems to be the truth, that Jonathan became part of our self-consciousness, so that understanding ourselves would no longer be possible without understanding him. It turns out that Jonathan became ever more and even more deeply part of my life when he became central to my marriage. He was Ben's closest friend, and one way or another brought us together. We got married on his birthday. We made sure to bring a special cake for him. He brought us a roasting pan. That was a very intentional gift because it was the beginning of many a grand feast, rack of lamb and duck confit. Whenever he intended to come over, he would send an email of warning, prepare the fatted calf. Then we had children, and he became Uncle Jonathan. He was with us for some very intimate moments. Eleanor's first steps, Eleanor's first snowman, Rosalind's first Christmas. He built Legos with the girls, and he took Charles to the zoo. At the same time of spending these intimate moments with our family, he became to our children something like a mythical figure. He would regale them with tales of traveling in Eastern Europe before the wall came down, of sailing across the Atlantic in hurricane season. He would send them movie clips of himself jumping off cliffs into frozen lakes. He would bring them back exotic gifts like volcanic rock earrings from the Azores. Perhaps Uncle Jonathan's most magical effect, though, was the way that he made Mommy and Daddy become 20 years younger whenever he visited. For a few days, we'd stop worrying about mortgages and water heaters and whether the freezer was actually freezing, and we'd live in our house like it was a home. Voices from the past took up residence there, as Jonathan, like Helen of Troy, laced our conversation with uncanny imitations of our former professors and friends. I knew for sure that he'd made his mark on posterity when one evening at dinner, my eldest daughter, who was about 9 at the time, wanted to make a point with a special emphasis, and she chose to do so in the style of Alan Bloom. Da, da. It was unbelievable. Jonathan's visits always reminded us who we had been, and therefore who we are. But we did not always heed such reminders. When I heard of Jonathan's death, my first thought was, I should have called him. I almost texted him last week. Why didn't I read that Hegel paper he sent me? When I look back over the email record, I find lots of messages, back and forth. Sorry, I'm busy. I'll try to call next week. Seminars keep me out at nights. I'm running errands all Saturday. I started working full-time a few years ago, and I find that our letters, looking back, I find our letters, which were once very long and intricate, have become briefer blips. Skimming through the messages of the last few years, I'm reminded of that scene from the opening credits of Mad Men, the one that Jonathan liked to cite so much, that nightmare free-fall scene that he references in his Hegel lecture to hauntingly connect with that sense of groundlessness, of loss of substance that is part of the burden of modernity. Jonathan tells us in that same lecture that without Penelope, there is no home to which Odysseus can return. Jonathan understood many things. I think there was a point in our lives that Ben and I thought that he understood everything that was worth understanding, that was worth to understand. Because when a person shapes you when you're that young, it's hard to get perspective on them. But I'd venture to say now that there was something crucial Jonathan did not understand. In his strenuous quests for a home, he may not have realized that he was one. And now the halls are empty, echoing. Late in life, as you all know, Jonathan took up the project of understanding Hegel in German. And he became interested in the dynamics of reconciliation between men and women, parents and children, between Athens and Jerusalem. To be honest, I find it hard to reckon with his death or to reconcile myself to it. But one of the things I learned from that Hegel lecture is that love is one of the forces of reconciliation, as it makes one conscious of one's membership in a larger whole. And now I simply hope that he knows how much he was loved.
minutes avec toi et regarder les gens en canard. Te parler du bon temps, qu'est-ce mon temps que viendra et sera dans mon cœur un petit doigt. Puis donner à bouffer à des pigeons idiots, le filet des coupières pour les veaux. Et d'entendre ton rire qui les a de les mieux, qui sait surtout guérir mes blessures. De raconter un peu quand j'étais minot, les bons becs faux boulus. Compliqué chez le marchand quand ça minto, caramel à en franc. Et les Mistral cognon. On marchait sous la pluie, 5 minutes avec toi, et regarder la vie tant qu'on a. Raconter la terre en te bouffant des yeux, te parler de ta mère en petit but. Et santé dans les flancs pour les faire râler, bousiller nos costas et se marrer. Et t'entendre ton rire comme on entend la mer, s'arrêter, repartir en arrière. Te compter surtout les cambabras d'antan et les cocoporaires et les vrais doudous qui nous copaient les lèvres et nous niquaient les dents et les Mistral cognons. Un soir sans banque, 5 minutes avec toi, à regarder les soleils qu'on va. Te parler du bon temps, qu'est-ce mon d'argent m'en veut, te dire que les méchants c'est pas nous. Que si moi je suis barge, ce n'est que de déus, car ils ont l'avantage d'être dus. Entendre ton rire s'envoler si haut, quand s'envole à l'écrit des oiseaux. Te raconter enfant qu'il faut aimer la vie, l'aimer en même aussi. Les tempêtes assassins et on porte avec lui les rires des enfants. Et les Mistral et les Mistral cognons.
Hello, I'm tutor. Sorry. I'm a senior, and I was one of Jonathan Hand's students, so I will try as best I can. I'm terrible at writing speeches, and in general, I try to wing it and hope for the best. But this is not the occasion to wing it, which makes it even the more difficult for me. I do not think I will do the speech justice for a man as great as Jonathan Hand. And I've spent weeks trying trying to work out what to say and how to say it. And as a result, have been putting it off until the last minute. So bear with me as I say the things I wish I had said to him. Dear Mr. Hand, you gave us all so much. You taught me many life lessons that I did not think I had learned until I realized that we would no longer be having the long conversations about all the books that we shared a love for, or even some of the books that one or both of us were less than fond of. You taught me about what it meant to truly be a cheerleader for your friends and students. You had a passion for the people you loved, and were truly there to support all of us, whether it be talking about the brilliance of your friends, like Miss Levy, or coming to the ACTC to hear our less than stellar readings of texts that were far beyond us. You were there to ask the hardest of questions because you believed that we should be pushed and constantly be striving to be better versions of ourselves. Your three-pronged questions were always there to stump us and force us to be thinking about what you had said, way beyond the conversations we had had. You were truly there to teach and to cultivate knowledge. It is hard to voice the feelings of appreciation that I have for you. How do you say thank you to a man who always had time for you? How do I voice the love that I have for the conversations that shape the way I think today? I stand here thinking about the many conversations we had about the books that will always be a part of me. And as I am in writing period, writing about Genesis, I have you to thank for me seeing the extraordinary beauty of the Bible and how it shapes the way we see the world is today. And through your readings of the Bible, I've spent the last few years trying to get the same richness from the text that you presented before us so many years ago. I think about the seminars we had where you pushed us to see beyond the first meaning of the text and push for something more. Push for us to ask the questions that were actually plaguing us rather than the questions that we believed to be the right ones to ask. Mr. Hand, as soon as you saw something in a student, you held them to a higher standard. You did not accept the simple run-of-the-mill answers or questions, but expected to see passion in our responses, care for our questions, and a love of the text. I had this belief that I simply liked philosophy and that I had no stake in literature. Yet through your guidance, as well as some of the other tutors here present today, I was able to recognize that many of the distinctions I had made between the types of texts were not there, and I had simply manufactured my beliefs because one of the types of texts were harder to access initially than the other. That some of the same questions that I was drawn to in philosophy, like how to live a good life, were present in literature, just presented in a different way. And as I think back to our sophomore seminar, with you and Mr. Applebaum in second semester, I think back to one night in particular. We were reading The Wife of Bath, and my mother was sitting in, listening to our conversations, and I, with my naive arrogance, believed that I could simplify the tale and move far away from the text in order to make sense of it. And instead of letting me get away with my poor reading because my mother was present, you called me out very bluntly and told me that I was speaking a load of shit. Sorry. So not only was I embarrassed in front of my peers, but I had my mother present as well. As seminar drew to an end, I expected my mother to be alarmed by your quick shutdown of my comments. But alas, my mother was ecstatic. That you had told me I was not thinking hard enough and went straight to tell you how excited she was for the rigor of thought you expected from me. And I, after a few deep breaths and a recovery of ego, acknowledged that without your push, I could not be the thinker I am today. I am saddened by the fact that I will no longer have you to hold me accountable for what I say and how hard I think. But as I look in front of me and see how many people you have pushed to be great, I am grateful to have them to help, and hopefully I can be the type of person who cares as much as you did. All I can say is thank you, and I'm sorry that I could not express as well as I wish the gratitude I have for you being my teacher and my friend. I am sorry that I never said thank you enough for all that you did for me, but I hope that you knew how much you mean to me and how much you have changed my life forever. I will always be indebted to you and your friendship. All the best, Tato Chalema. Thank you.
Words, phrases, memories, images, quotes, jokes, so many jokes have streamed through my imagination daily since Jonathan's passing. But it remains so difficult for me to find the right words, whatever that means. And that leads me to use too many, and so bear with me. And now it seems to me that they're all fragments or reflections of what we've heard so far. I wish to honor and celebrate his life, to express the profound gratitude I feel for the indelible, decisive mark he left on me, for the outrageously delightful and sometimes maddening, often delightful because maddening, times we spent together. But I confess my feelings of sadness, confusion, and frankly, anger at his passing, and the powerful sense that a Jonathan-shaped hole in my world will travel with me for a long time, forever, are still with me. I have to acknowledge that. It wasn't easy living with him as a friend, and it is much harder still to let him go. His sister Patty said recently he was larger than life. So true, so beautifully, absurdly, magnificently true. Jonathan contained fascinating multitudes within him, and even people who knew him well could be forgiven for not really seeing or believing all of it. I didn't see all of it. His academic accomplishments, extraordinary and perhaps most visible to us here, yes, but also his incredible, unscripted, and sometimes remarkably dangerous travels all over the world, his teaching sailing over many summers, his crewing a sailboat on a physically exhausting North Atlantic passage on his sabbatical, summers spent traveling in the Greek Isles or Turkey or Italy, long daily swims in the Mediterranean, skiing from town to town across the Alps, taking his bike on the train to Albuquerque and cycling all over town. His love of smart pop culture, going to see live stand-up comedy, or Weird Al Yankovic, as he once reported, to my surprise. His serious study, if I might put it that way, of Mad Men, or Downton Abbey, or South Park. His love of jokes and impersonations. A former student once sent him a mixtape titled I See London, I See France, with the rest of that off-color playground taunt left unstated. The tape had British invasion rock, the Stones, the Beatles on one side, and some of his favorite French pop music on the other. He loved that. He loved how that student got him. His playfulness, his sense of humor and innuendo, his delight in that pop music, his love of Europe, his deep connection to his family, especially his devotion to his parents, his rootedness in his eternal home in Ithaca. All of that lurking behind his jaunty grin with a cocked hat on his head. As dean and as a colleague, I will say now what I would say to some people while he was with us, risking hyperbole, and in a sense saying something impossible. He was the best reader and the best teacher we had here. He had enormous intellectual gifts, surprisingly voracious for and obsessive with mathematics and physics, and with politics, and with the philosophy and literature that were his foundation. And he combined his gifts with an intensity, a relentlessness, an incandescence that was powerful and even more rare, at times too powerful to be contained in the word teacher. One philosopher famously wrote, "I am dynamite." And sometimes, often even, Jonathan could feel like such dynamite. He learned from some of his teachers, Harvey Mansfield, Alan Bloom, that it was possible for these books, for philosophy, and for teachers to make all the difference, if and only if teachers and students could go right to the nerves of the books and the arguments where everything was at stake, to cut through jargon, to risk impoliteness and offense, to, as I long said of Jonathan, to strip and wrestle naked, to use a Platonic image for the most serious and vulnerable business of conversation and dialectic. He got into the game for all of that, not to play it safe, not to have a career, not to be esteemed or win accolades, but to be ready, like a great poker player, to push out all his chips when it mattered most, to drop everything and follow the argument wherever it led. Book after book, conversation after conversation, he was able to take me, take students, take friends to the center of things, to the difficult places where our hearts and souls' demands were all at stake and in play. But what a risk, and sometimes what a cost. I know, as we've heard, that sometimes when he sensed it could matter, he put more hours, many more hours, sleepless nights of reading and thinking into, for example, preparing for one senior oral where he thought the stakes were high. More than I believe, from my experience, any of my other colleagues do. Certainly more than I ever had or ever would. More than once, I saw a senior on the business end of that preparation. In copious notes, Jonathan wrote, but especially in an oral bordering on interrogation. And that wasn't always easy to watch. Would they learn from that? Would they be grateful for it? Would they realize that it came from deep respect, from seeing them as worth that effort, that tension? I hope so, but it was a risk. It was teaching without a net. And whatever the outcome, he poured his lifeblood into that kind of effort. In reading hundreds of old emails from him in recent weeks, I came across one where a student who had left the college had written a cringeworthy, casual, familiar, and self-deluded request to Jonathan for a letter of recommendation after failing his class. Serious miscalculation. But Jonathan was the only tutor I know who would have responded as he did, and he copied me in as dean. He wrote a long letter, a brutally honest letter, let's say, and added, "Is that the letter you want sent?" St. John's is forgiving, the world less so, he said, closing with, "Buckle up." He put hours into crafting that, trying to do good for that student, to jolt that student into waking up. In fact, his sincere plea was that the student really should return to the college. I, like many of us, I think, would probably have written a 2-sentence note politely declining. One of the things that he and I agreed strongly about is that beyond the job as a job, beyond colleges as institutions, beyond all our rules and practices, beyond syllabuses and curricula, beyond the books, beyond teaching as a vocation even, at the heart of it all was and is an uncontrollable, unmanageable quest to get to the bottom of everything, to get to what matters, and to fight for what matters. You can't domesticate that. And for someone like Jonathan, who was always ready to push his chips out, there would always be risks and costs. Prices he'd pay, bruises others would take. If all of us were like Jonathan, we wouldn't have a college, as he frankly acknowledged, and I think wore as a badge of pride. But if none of us are like him, the peak of what we are about ceases even to be visible. Without someone like Jonathan, some of us would never hear the one thing needful. We'd never realize both how deep and how immediate the books can be in speaking to us. To borrow from a revered author he respected, Jonathan reminds us of the sacrifices we must make in order that our minds may be free. Like Falstaff, like Socrates, life is simpler, maybe easier without him. But real education will always involve such dynamite. Certainly some of us carry bruises. He carried bruises from his not playing it safer. But I know so many students and friends who were given treasures and riches through his teaching, through that incandescence. And for us, it was worth all the costs. He was my late friend, my last friend with whom the conversation would go on forever. Not everyone understands these friendships that are forged through hours and hours of arguing about philosophy, about the good, the true, and the beautiful, with all that entails. But here at St. John's, I don't think it sounds too strange to us. I venture to say that for those of us for whom that is the highest or one of the highest forms of friendship, we recognize that you only get a very few friends with whom you can share almost everything, understand each other, drive each other to the edge of what you understand, bring to articulation the questions that are just beyond that understanding. And if you can do that with shared loves of music, poetry, film, travel, food, and drink, well, all the better. What a miracle. And it seems to me those friendships tend to come during and perhaps fade after a certain season of life. I met Jonathan our first week as tutors at the college, the first person I met here, before classes, any meetings. In August 2003, we were both coincidentally sitting at the Coyote Cafe. I can say now I never expected at that point in my life to have another friend, to join maybe the one or two from the previous decades with whom I could share all of that. I thought that season of life was likely over. That friend you see on your way somewhere else and end up still at the coffee shop, the bar, the park bench, driving in the country hours and hours later, having forgotten or let go whatever else you meant to do that day. That first day, Jonathan and I sat down together over a margarita and talked. Our first conversation went on for hours. I still remember exact phrases and formulations we used. We disclosed our views on religion, our deepest commitments, our loves and lost loves, the books and authors we had in common. And for all the intervening years, that conversation, though interrupted by days, weeks, months, and much later, even years, never ended. I thought the season for such friendship, for such ecstatic and wonderfully desperate conversation had ended. But Jonathan, at his core, was a kind of eternal springtime of the possibility of such friendship. It was what he lived for, agonizingly irreconcilable as it might be with what counts as daily life for many or all of us. Part of Jonathan's vocation was to be, as Plato wrote of the Greeks, forever young in this way. I think any of Jonathan's close friends and as many interlocutors and colleagues with shared interests know him as the one who would keep that dialogue going forever, all night, as in Plato's Symposium, as long as we could get to what matters. It was hard to keep up, hard to sustain. My memories of Jonathan include so many nights where he would nurse a last drink in a kind of Zeno's paradox, just splitting it. Nurse a last drink or jealously defend a last bite on a plate from greedy waiters and busboys trying to turn a table. Or he might end up reclined on your couch, and he would seem content if the conversation never ended. You felt, I felt, like a mortal who needed sleep and rest, hanging on by a thread with an Olympian who was prepared to stay at the feast forever. At the end of every semester, we used to plan one escapist day in Albuquerque. For years, he loved to make that drive in my Miata convertible, top down, music playing, driving and talking, walking and talking, eating and drinking and talking. Peripatetics, dreamers, adventurers of the mind in search of serendipity. Serendipity. He was with me at the dinner where I chanced to meet Megan in the great good fortune of my life, and he was the first person I called the next morning. See, that is the kind of woman I should be with. I would have said something more poetic if I'd known I'd be repeating it here 15 years later. But that's what I said. Jonathan was a great acolyte of serendipity. Among his favorite films, one we discussed many times for many hours, was Richard Linklater's Before Sunrise. Together with the rest of that amazingly conceived trilogy, tracking the fate of a romance sparked on a train with one night of wandering the streets of Vienna, during which two kindred souls passing in the night test their destiny together. Jonathan consciously and well understood that he lived his life as if the magic of that movie might strike anywhere, any day, as romance, as friendship, as intellectual insight or epiphany. We all have those hopes in us, but he lived it relentlessly, ever renewed. It animated his European wanderings. It animated his desire never to end the conversation. It animated his interest in what surprising next thing might come from a student's first reading of Plato, from the exigencies of a seminar, from nature, from art. I said of him, to him, that he loved not wisely but too well, like Othello. And I said that from a place of deep sympathy and shared unreasonable hopes. I've thought of that phrase often since his passing. That edge of glistening romantic hope married to such a rigorous intellect was dynamite. As his friend, it was hard to keep the faith, hard not to disappoint, like Prince Hal with Falstaff, hard not to be the first one to blink, to give up on the quest and return to life, to the demands of the day. But Jonathan was always there, waiting, ready, there on the far side of all of everyday life, ready to renew the quest, to forgive all, if we could just go again straight to the heart of things. He was larger than life. He was Falstaff, which I intend and he took as the highest praise. His ideas and words, his wit, his perpetual youth, his incandescence will stay with many of us who are blessed to get close to him, to travel with him in all senses. With a grateful heart, I today mourn the passing, but celebrate with abundant gratitude the life of a great teacher, the rarest of friends, and a bright, restless soul who illuminated the world for me and many others, one with whom I shared so many adventures, adventures that are the stuff of life.
Thank you, Walter. By way of introduction, I'm Sonia. I'm Jonathan's youngest sister. I'm here with my two other sisters, Jonathan's two other little sisters, Brooke and Patty. And I definitely want to point out that we're representing our parents as well in Ithaca. They would have loved to have been here, but they did not feel up to making this trip, quite understandably, I think. None of us has a job that involves a lectern. So I'm going to keep my remarks short and sweet so as not to embarrass myself. It's one of those moments where I wish I would give anything if Jonathan would walk through the door and do this for me. He'd be much better at it. As Ben will tell you, he gave beautiful toasts. Mostly I just want to say thank you. I want to say thank you to all of you for coming today. Jonathan would insert a joke here about choosing to watch Netflix at home instead, but I'll just simply acknowledge that you could have been doing something less challenging, less emotionally challenging. And so I appreciate your choosing to spend your free time this way. I also want to thank the speakers, some of whom came from very far away, and all of whom clearly took great time and effort to prepare their remarks. That really makes a big impression on us. And obviously I want to thank the administration and the staff of St. John's for planning this beautiful service and for being so thoughtful and deferential to our needs and to think about us during the planning. We really appreciate that. And more than just thanking you for today, I really want to thank you all here for the last 15, 16 years at the college. I asked my mother if there was anything special she would like me to relate, anything I could say on her behalf. And after thinking about it for a couple of minutes, she said, you know, I just want them to know that this was his dream job. And that's incredibly true. How many people get to say that? Not very many. It's clear that Jonathan and St. John's were made for each other. You know, from the focus on teaching and the primacy of that when choosing tutors, rather than the BS of research and publishing and fame or any of those things. Grant writing, all that. Obviously, he was dedicated to the great books and had been since long before he came here, so that was fitting. He was a Renaissance man, as everyone knows. So the idea of teaching things beyond his specialty was daunting, but I think challenged him in a really exciting way. I remember talking to him about preparing for classes for which he had no background. It might surprise you to know that there were subjects that he felt less confident about, but he, I'm sure, never gave that impression. And it is my understanding that arguing is permitted and encouraged here, and Lord knows he loved to argue. So it's really comforting to us to know that he had landed in the right place and that you really appreciated him and his talents and his abilities and his effort, and that you understood him. You know, you really got him in a very deep way. It's clear that you loved him. And I think he would agree with me that the time he spent here gave his life meaning and purpose, a real moral purpose. And obviously, he had a tremendous impact on hundreds, if not thousands, of students. And may I point out, all of whom are citizens of, if not this country, the world. And I think he would be pleased to note that I would acknowledge that that was important to him, that he was creating people who might think carefully and make this world a better place. I think it's not an exaggeration to say that teaching here was his calling, and he really gave it everything he had. Maybe too much sometimes. I can't help but invoke the 80-20 rule. He would have hated that phrase. He's cringing right now, shaking his fist, yelling at me, but I invoke it only to say he clearly did not believe in it. And that was to all of our benefit, for sure. So it's so special for us, the sisters and my parents on previous occasions, to have been able to come here and to see what a special place this is, and to meet his friends and his colleagues and his students, and to see how much you appreciate him, and to hear all of your kind words, and to know that he had been in the right place, was in the right place. And also to allow us to remember this event and remember your words. And my parents will watch this recording. And it's great to be able to have the memories of this day to help us remember him. That's incredibly special. And so thank you so much on behalf of the whole family. Thank you.
That concludes our memorial for Jonathan. Thank you all for coming. He would like the next part. Please join us for food and drink down the hall. And don't forget to sign the guest book. It's back there against the wall on the table. Thank you.